In this video, we are going to continue the overview the topic of non-probability sampling design. Part 2. But first, let's have a quick recap of the previous video. In the previous video, we have discussed definition of terms such as population, sample and sampling and a quick recap on the data collection process. We also have covered the explanation of probability sampling. So, in this video, non-probability sampling is a method of sampling in which there is no randomized way of individuals from a population to be selected as a sample. That's why it is also known as non-randomized sampling. The basic premise of non-probability sampling is a researcher selects individuals because they are available, convenient or represent some characteristics the researcher seeks to study. It is commonly used in qualitative research, than quantitative research. There are 4 types of non-probability sampling. First, convenience sampling. Second, snowball sampling. Third, quota sampling. Lastly, purposive sampling. Let's have an overview of each of the non-probability sampling now. First, convenience sampling. In this sampling design, researcher selects participants because they are willing and available to be studied. For example, let's say a researcher wants to study teachers' perceptions on the implementation of 21st-century learning strategies. While attending a conference in which most of the attendees are teachers, this researcher uses this opportunity to distribute a set of survey questionnaire to the attendees. This is a classic example of convenience sampling in which a researcher uses available people who happen to be in a place as samples. Data is gathered from those who are willing to give their response of the questionnaire. For example, let's say a researcher wants to study teachers' perceptions on the implementation of 21st-century learning strategies. While attending a conference in which most of the attendees are teachers, this researcher uses this opportunity to distribute a set of survey questionnaire to the attendees. This is a classic example of convenience sampling in which a researcher uses available people who happen to be in a place as samples. Data is gathered from those who are willing to give their response of the questionnaire. Second, snowball sampling. For snowball sampling, researcher asks participants who are selected as sample of a research to identify others to participate in the research as well. This might be commonly done if a researcher needs to get enough samples in a study. For example, a researcher asks a participant to introduce him or her to another person who will be a sample of his or her study. Based on the introduction of participants from former or previous participants, the researcher will get more participants. For quota sampling, researcher selects participants through certain ways in which they divide the population of interest into strata, or groups of individuals that are similar in some way that is important to the response. In this case, it might look similar with stratified sampling, yet the main difference is in quota sampling. The selection of samples does not according to the proportion of subgroups in a population. For example, if the proportion of a subgroup such as race in Malaysia is 60 to 15, 15-10 for Malay, Chinese, Indian and other minority race, a researcher needs to identify other categories of subgroups which the people from different races belong to, such as their gender, education level and socioeconomic status. In this case, there are layers of categories of samples need to be identified first before they are selected randomly according to their proportion. Next, we go to another type of non-probability sampling, which is purposive sampling. In this case, the selection of the participants is based on characteristics of a population and the objective of the study. It is also known as judgmental sampling, or selective sampling. For example, a researcher wants to explore the experience of teachers who had undergone training with teacher for Malaysia. So, the researcher would only select those who had undergone training with teacher for Malaysia as samples. Now, let's continue the discussion on the categories of sampling design. In general, sampling in research can be divided into 2. They are known as probability sampling and non-probability sampling. It is common for quantitative researchers to use probability sampling due to the purpose of generalization rather than non-probability sampling. In this series, we will only focus on the discussion of probability sampling. There is another video which will focus on non-probability sampling. To end our overview of sampling design in social sciences research, Part 2, let's have a quick recap of what we have discussed so far. In this video, we have covered the basic premise of non-probability sampling. There are 4 types of non-probability sampling, which are convenience sampling, snowball sampling, quota sampling and purposive sampling. That's all from me now. Don't forget to watch other videos from my channel which might be related to your field of study.